Hi guys, we're going to talk about ecological succession. So let me pull up my screen. Okay, so the idea with ecosystems, right, is they are this group of many different species of living organisms that exist within a community, and then they interact with non-living components of ecosystems, these physical environmental factors. And then, of course, what makes an ecosystem an ecological system is that there is kind of this interdependent relationship and then this movement of matter and energy between different organisms, between organisms and their environment, and between the environment back to organisms. So an important component of an ecological system or an ecosystem is the biological community, which is all the different individuals of different species. So all those populations that exist within the ecosystem. And the idea with ecological succession is that it changes over time. The ecosystem changes over time. The biological community changes over time. It's not fixed. And this happens because interactions, both between different species and between species and their environment, change over time. They don't occur in exactly the same way as the ecosystem persists through time. And so this can be changes to the way that plants interact with other plants, that other organisms interact with plants, that plants interact with the environment, that the environment interacts with plants. And then, of course, this influences the way that all these organisms influence or interact with animals, interact with bacteria, interact with fungi, lots of other organisms. But because when we kind of take a snapshot look of what the ecosystem looks like over time, plants are such a dominant structural feature, a lot of times our thinking about ecological succession is really driven by thinking about how the plant community changes over time. So that's why I keep referring to plants here, but that's not the only thing that changes in the process of ecological succession. So the other important thing about ecological succession is that the biologic community and the ecosystem changes over time, and it changes in a predictable sequence. So if we know things about the climate, if we know things about the biological community that we're starting with at a particular moment in time, we can predict how that system is going to change. So this is where the idea of succession comes in. So succession in the context of like a prince or princess succeeding a previous monarch, like what comes next. That's what the idea, that's what this term succession refers to. So the way that an ecosystem is going to change over time. Okay, so there's actually two different types of succession. There's kind of a type of succession that's called primary succession. And this is a very early stage of ecological succession where we're dealing with basically no organisms to start out with on a new substrate, which is like a new bit of ground that has previously been kind of stripped of all organisms. And then in that case, what's going to happen is pioneer species, which we mentioned are usually going to be these R-selected species, are going to come in and start to colonize this new land. And then they're going to start to change the landscape over time. So it's going to experience succession. It's going to change in predictable ways as new species are going to be able to come in because of the changes to the environment that were done due to the interactions with the first pioneer species. So you can imagine after a glacier recedes and there's a bunch of new rock that's exposed, or a volcanic eruption happens and a bunch of lava flows out into an area, you're kind of starting all over, building an ecosystem. And so that's called primary succession. Then secondary succession is in a location where there may have been changes. We refer to these as disturbances in the ecosystem, but the changes were not so extreme, like a complete volcanic eruption that annihilated every living thing, or a glacier that completely stripped the landscape down to rock. But there would have been plants, there would have been soil that were still existing on the ecosystem after a disturbance. And still, however, there's going to start to be some changes that are going to occur in a predictable sequence after this disturbance, like a forest fire, a landslide, a beetle outbreak that kills all the trees in the forest, comes through. And so it's going to set off a sequence of changes in the ecosystem, a period of ecological succession, and that is referred to as secondary succession. Okay, so here's an example of primary succession. This is an island off the Antarctic Peninsula. With climate change, some of the glaciers have been receding and exposing rock, and what's coming in first are lichens. So lichens are being blown through the air, and they are growing on these rocks. They are eating away the rocks over time through exudates, through acids that they are putting out, and then they're breaking down little components of rock, mixing it with dead lichen, mixing it with air, mixing it with water to make little pockets of soil. So over time, new seeds that are blown into this area will be able to grow in these little pockets of soil that are built. And maybe if we could come back and see this in another 10,000 years, it would look very different because it will be experiencing ecological succession. But currently it's in a period of primary succession. Here's another example of ecological succession, but in this case, a secondary succession example. So these pictures are taken in Plumas County. They're actually different spots, but in the similar forest type where ecological succession is taking place. So here on the left, there has been a removal of trees through a logging operation that has opened up the site. And so that disturbance is going to set off a series of successional changes. So the first kinds of species that are going to come and grow well in this forest are not the kinds of species that were dominating here before. So it's going to be things like grasses. Those are pioneer species. Other things like thistles, or could be some invasive species, could be also other native species like shrub species. They tend to do really well after succession. And also some little seeds from the conifer trees and other kinds of trees that were here in the past will start to grow up as well. They might not grow as slowly, they might not do as well or be as competitive in this environment that's really different. It's more sunny, it's more exposed than the previous forest environment where they were living. But over time, those conifers will continue to grow, and eventually they'll start to grow so much that they'll shade out the other pioneer species that were doing really well when this was this big open sunny environment. So if we came back maybe 100 years later, what we would see is that trees would now be dominating, and the shrubs that were previously dominating the site have not been able to survive. They're not competitive. They experience too much physiological stress in this ecosystem that has changed around them. The shade from the trees is changing the physical environment, changing the competitive advantage of different species, and causing an ecological succession. And then eventually over time, some of these older trees will die and other trees will kind of come up. And so this would be kind of like what you might think of as an old growth forest, or what we would call like a late successional stage or late seral stage ecosystem. So seral as in series, late in the series, and this would be like an early seral stage ecosystem and an early successional stage ecosystem. And late successional stage ecosystems are not always forests. If you lived in a climate that supported the tundra, or a climate that supported a grassland, or a climate that supported a desert environment, the late successional stage might not look like this, but it's still good, could be a forest, or sorry, an ecosystem that has kind of been through many other stages of change. And the idea with these later successional stages is until another disturbance comes along, they're fairly stable. Okay, so what are these disturbances? Well, disturbances are things that initiate succession. They're natural parts of ecosystems. They can be accelerated or introduced by humans as well. So we would think of those as anthropogenic, right? That means man created anthropogenic disturbances. But again, lots of these are natural things. So things like fire have always occurred as parts of ecosystems. Landslides and hurricanes have always occurred as parts of ecosystems. And they're actually important because they promote regeneration and they actually promote diversity on the landscape. So after we have disturbances, we'll see that the ecosystem is going to look very different for a period of time, although over time it will experience ecological succession until it eventually returns to a very similar look than it had before the disturbance. That might take many hundreds of years before it can do that, or thousands of years, depending on the ecosystem type. But if we leave it alone, it will get there. And in the process, it creates lots of different stages of ecological succession to broaden overall ecosystem diversity. And again, it will promote regeneration. Many types of organisms actually require disturbance before they can regenerate. So this is another thing that limits intra-specific competition. So for example, many pine species will not regenerate until a forest fire occurs. There's too much resin around the seeds that prevents them from growing. And so they depend on a big disturbance like a wildfire to remove that resin to be able to grow. And this is important because if they tried to grow up under a dense forest canopy, then they would not have the light resources and the water resources that they need. So they're going to wait till the overstory is removed, and then that species is going to come up and try to do its best. And it's going to, of course, then not have as much competition with the older generation. Okay, so the last thing I'll say is that there is an idea of a climax community, which is basically like the last stage of ecological succession. And again, we said it's not necessarily a forest. It could be a grassland, a desert environment, a tundra environment, an ice sheet, depending on the climate there. But the idea is once an ecosystem enters this final climax community state, then it's kind of a self-perpetuating state that will continue to exist. It's not going to change beyond that until another disturbance comes in and kind of knocks it back to an earlier successional stage. It's a bit controversial because many ecologists feel like disturbance is such an inherent part of ecosystems that it's not really realistic to imagine that we would have these late sterile stages existing forever, that's really not how it actually works. But regardless, this is an important ecological concept that you'll hear about a lot. Okay, that's a good stopping point.